This particular chapter marked the first time I used my new recording setup, including a standing mic stand and a booth surrounding me. As a result, this is the first time I've recorded an entire chapter while standing upright to use the full power of my diaphragm. If I sound a little more out of breath than usual or anything else out of the ordinary, this is probably why. Also, it is the first chapter I have recorded since coming back from a month-long vacation, so I'm probably a touch out of practice. I ask that you keep all of these things in mind for the following chapter, and I hope you enjoy. Chapter 36. The Looking. The world around Twilight Sparkle was barely more than a blur of light and color as she raced through the town in a frenzied pursuit. Her singed cloak waved wildly in the breeze caused by her haste, the alicorn fighting through the pain of her injury on her right foreleg. She hadn't had time to dress the wound properly, and instead had settled for a few quick layers of gauze and a couple of effective, but uncomfortable and slow-acting healing spells she had been able to recall in the heat of the moment. It wasn't pleasant, and it even made the wound sting and burn more than it would have otherwise. But momentary creature comforts were far from her mind, especially with the current crisis she had to deal with.
I'm such an idiot!
She silently screamed at herself.
How could I let this happen?
Every hurried step and haggard breath brought her only more anxiety and guilt, her mind throwing an unending stream of hypothetical ways she could have prevented this tragedy. What she could have said, what she could have done, anything she could have done to stop this from happening all went through her head. Not that any of it really mattered anymore. What was done was done. Nothing could change that now. No matter how badly Twilight wished she could go back and fix her mistakes. And that was what hurt more than anything else right now. The fact that all of this was her fault. Her outbursts, her utter failure in explaining things, each and every single thing that had gone wrong today was absolutely her fault. She had to fight the desire to scream out Spike's name in the hopes that the little guy would respond, but she couldn't bring herself to act on those impulses. Even now, lost in this torrential sea of her own emotions, there was still some strand of rationale that prevented her from blowing Spike's cover.
He couldn't have gotten far. He has to be around here somewhere.
She continued to tell herself through this fruitless effort to try and steady her nerves, continuing to check just about every nook and cranny that looked remotely big enough for Spike to fit in. These locations ranged from everything, from bushes to large baskets, and even a fruit stand or two. Not a stone was left unturned in her search, some of which earned her an understandable amount of questions and scolding from the citizens of Ponyville. Most of which Twilight either just blatantly ignored or replied with hasty, half-hearted apologies. Again, she didn't care about anything else right now. But, if nothing else, the lack of any dragon-related panic going on at least meant that Spike hadn't been found by anyone else as of yet. That was one thing she could hold on to.
Where in the world did he even go?
The alicorn growled at herself through clenched teeth, shaking her head in mixed disappointment and frustration as she yet again failed to find him, this time in another patch of shrubbery. The urge to lash out in anger was strong, and it took every ounce of her strength not to. Her logic was simple. She had enough problems to deal with without the complications of property damage. She sighed, continuing to ignore the glances she was getting from the townsfolk around her. She knew she needed to calm down, as hard as it was to even consider that a possibility. Even just trying to slow down and think was harrowing, as every inch of her body refused to stop shaking from the anxiety. Even so, she tried. She had a truly brilliant mind, and she needed to work it properly right now. As she fought the urge to limp as she strode through Ponyville, The distraught equine was at last able to formulate the question that might lead to her salvation.
Where would he even go?
That was the billion-bit question. Ponyville may have been small in comparison to places like Canterlot, but it was still a fairly large village. A fairly large village where Twilight's own settlement was fairly close to the center, meaning that Spike could have gone just about anywhere, depending on what direction he took off in. But the real question was where he would go, as redundant as it sounded. The last she had seen of him, he was acting irrationally. He was probably still being driven by emotion and impulse, just like Twilight was right now. He was probably scared and angry, and probably looking for a safe place to hide, if Twilight's hunch was correct. All of a sudden, the metaphorical light flashed to life in Twilight's head, her eyes practically glowing as the idea came to fruition. In hindsight, it almost made too much sense. If Spike wanted to feel safe right now, there was only one other place in this town she could see him running off to in a time like this. The fact that she hadn't thought to go there first was irritating, but she didn't have time to beat herself up for it. Ignoring the pain in her leg, she took off running as fast as she possibly could. After several minutes of non-stop running, she was rewarded with a euphoric sense of hope swelling in her heart as her destination came into view. Fluttershy's humble cottage, looking more like a sanctuary than it ever had before. There was no other place in the world she could imagine Spike being right now, as the Yellow Pegasus had been an undeniable source of support for the two over their stay in Ponyville, all because of a simple act of kindness on the Pegasi's part, after another one of Twilight's spectacular failures. If anyone could help her right now, it was Fluttershy. And this dependence on the other equine was made evident by Twilight's enthusiastic, to put a word to it, beatdown on Fluttershy's front door. The wait for the mayor to come and investigate that series of loud bangs was agonizing in its own right. And when the door was swung open to reveal the now distressed-looking Pegasus within, Twilight couldn't help but feel a little bit of baseless hope that her dragon would be here.
Have you seen Spike?
Twilight wasted no time in blurting out, not even giving Fluttershy the chance to address her.
I don't know where he is. I can't find him anywhere.
Her words were fast, warbly, practically on the verge of being incomprehensible gibberish.
It's Twilight? What's going on?
The Pegasus was clearly caught off guard by Twilight's tone, to the point she hadn't even caught on to what Twilight had said.
Why are you... I don't have time for this.
Twilight wasn't so nice in pushing her way into Fluttershy's home, her head darting up and down and all around in any search for her missing companion.
Spike? Spike! Are you here?
The only answer she was given was the chatter and clamor of the various animals that lived here, as they responded to her shouting, scattering away from the sudden and noisy intruder and her outcries. It was these outcries that got Fluttershy's attention, bringing a similar look of distress to her face.
Twilight, what's going on? Shouldn't Spike be with you? He ran away.
Twilight was able to choke out in her panicked state, still looking high and low for some sign of him, even though he clearly wasn't here. She turned back to Fluttershy to try and continue the explanation.
And now I don't know where he is. I don't know where else to look.
Fluttershy remained silent for a short while, the worried look on her face only growing more so.
Does he even know how to get here?
That question made way too much sense in the grand scheme of things. A fact that sobered Twilight's mind very clearly, silencing every voice in her head in an instant. It should have been obvious if she wasn't in the midst of this mental breakdown. She wanted to kick herself for not realizing it. After all, how would Spike know how to get to Fluttershy's cottage? Every time he and Twilight had come here, he had been carried in the confines of Twilight's saddlebag. Her dark, vision-blocking saddlebag. A measure to keep his existence a secret from prying eyes. Another secret of Twilight's that served to hurt Spike in the long run. Twilight actually started laughing at the absurdity of this whole situation, and how quickly she had clung to the delusion that Spike would have been here. Slowly chuckling like a madmare at this waking nightmare she had found herself trapped in. With time, the soft laughter transformed into light sobbing, as the weight and dread of these circumstances came to fall on her shoulders. Her knees shuddered and shook, before finally giving up the ghost, forcing her to sit with a soft thump. Her son was gone, lost and likely afraid, aimlessly wandering around because he didn't know his way around because of Twilight's sheer incompetence as a guardian. She didn't care that this was the third pony she had cried in front of today. Or did she even recognize that Fluttershy was even there? She was too far gone in her mind, the wrenching in her chest making it impossible to care about anything other than her plight.
And what do you mean he ran away? Why would he...
The Pegasus had her questions interrupted by another series of sharp knocks on her door. Not quite as frantic as Twilight's, though. At first, Fluttershy ignored the newest visitor, but when the knocking began to intensify, she was left with no choice.
I'll be right back. I'm sorry.
The apology didn't even register to Twilight. Oh, she was too far gone to even think about worrying about such trivial things. She was enveloped in anguish and self-pity and unbearable despair. A powerful tightness began to grow in her chest as she glared down at the floorboards, making it harder to breathe in this dire moment. Her heavy breathing was one of the only sounds that reached her ears, alongside the heavy pounding of her heartbeat.
Spike's gone!
That was something that was finally beginning to sink in for what it really was. A deathly shiver ran down her spine and through her hidden wings, sitting there trying to deny the reality of her situation. She didn't want to come to terms with it. She wished with all her heart that this nightmare would just end already. Her son was gone. She had no idea where in the world he could have gone, and she had spent far too much time on this last-ditch effort. And with this lead proven to be a dead end, she had no idea what else she could do.
What am I going to do?
The alicorn asked of herself, rocking back and forth as the hopelessness swelled within her.
What is he going to do?
Some time passed before Fluttershy came back from whatever it was she was doing, a pensive look of anxiety strewn over her face. Whatever had happened at the front door had clearly caused her some form of distress. Not that Twilight was in any state of mind to care. The Pegasus paced back and forth before her distracted guest, looking unsure of exactly what to say. She would move to start a sentence, only to quickly bite her lip with a groan before returning to her pacing. Eventually, though, her indecision ended, and Fluttershy spoke.
Twilight? I think I know where Spike went.
The change in Twilight's demeanor was immediate, and she bolted back up to a standing position as fast as she could. Her wide, pleading eyes drilled into Fluttershy's, practically begging for the information that had just been promised without saying a word. It wasn't even necessary for her to ask, but that didn't stop her from asking anyway. But the newfound sense of hope in Twilight was diluted by Fluttershy meekly sinking into herself. Whatever new information she had must not have been quite what Twilight was looking for. It felt like an impossibly long time before Fluttershy was able to muster up the courage to speak again. And if words could kill, what she said next would have killed Twilight right then and there.
Do you want the good news or the bad news?